The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered in growing numbers. Among the sea of visitors, cameras ready and eyes wide with anticipation, stood families eager to witness one of London's most famous sights, the Royal Guards in their iconic red uniforms and tall bearskin hats. James Wilson adjusted his stance slightly as he took his position. At 32 years old, he had served as a Royal Guard for 7 years, mastering the art of standing perfectly still for hours regardless of weather, noise, or the endless attempts by tourists to make him smile. The weight of the bearskin hat and the tight collar of his scarlet tunic were familiar discomforts he no longer noticed. Remember, his commanding officer had told all new guards during training, "You represent centuries of tradition. Your stillness is a symbol of unwavering duty to the crown." This morning was like any other. James stared straight ahead, his eyes focused on nothing and everything. His face remained expressionless as the crowd grew. To his right, another guard named Michael Thompson stood with equal discipline. They had trained together and developed the mutual respect of men who understood the unique challenges of their role. A group of American tourists approached, laughing and pointing. "I bet I can make him blink," a teenage boy declared loudly to his friends. James had heard it all before. The jokes, the funny faces, the ridiculous dances. None of it fazed him anymore. His mind had learned to drift while his body remained at attention, a skill developed over thousands of hours of guard duty. A light breeze carried the sounds of London traffic beyond the palace gates. James could smell the fresh coffee from a nearby vendor and hear snippets of different languages as tour guides explained the history of the guards to their groups. French, German, Japanese, Spanish. The world came to witness this display of British tradition. "The Queen's Guard never breaks character," one guide explained to her group. "These soldiers are fully operational military personnel, not actors. Their discipline is legendary." Children often found the guards most fascinating. Some waved shyly while others mimicked their stance. Parents lifted small children for photos, instructing them to stand tall, just like the guard. James saw it all in his peripheral vision while appearing to see nothing. By mid-morning, the autumn air had warmed slightly. Across the courtyard, the changing of the guard would happen soon, bringing even larger crowds. But for now, James remained at his post, occasionally performing the precisely timed ritual of marching 5 paces, turning sharply, and returning to stillness. Few tourists understood the reality behind the spectacle. Before becoming royal guards, these men had often served in combat zones. James himself had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan. The discipline required to stand motionless was nothing compared to the discipline needed in conflict. His mind sometimes drifted to those memories, though his face never revealed these thoughts. The crowd shifted, and James noticed a school group approaching. Children in navy blue uniforms lined up as their teacher explained the guard's significance in hushed tones. Among them, a small girl with a pale face caught his attention briefly. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. As noon approached, more visitors arrived, cameras clicking constantly. The grand tradition continued as it had for centuries, the guards unmoved by weather, fatigue, or distraction. James Wilson stood as a living symbol of duty and discipline, unaware that in just a few hours he would make a decision that would challenge everything his uniform represented. The morning shifted into afternoon as the September sun climbed higher in the sky. James Wilson maintained his perfect stance, his red uniform bright against the pale stone of Buckingham Palace. Tourists came and went in waves, their excitement rising whenever the guards performed their precise, mechanical march every hour. A group of Italian tourists moved away, replaced by a school group from northern England. Their teacher, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, kept her students in a neat line. "Remember, children, these guards have a very important job. They protect the royal family and represent hundreds of years of tradition." James heard everything but showed no reaction. His training had prepared him for all kinds of distractions. Once, a man had even dressed as a chicken and danced in front of him for 10 minutes. James hadn't blinked then, and he wouldn't now. At the edge of the crowd, a woman in her 30s approached, holding the hand of a small girl. The child walked slowly, her steps careful and measured. She wore a bright yellow hat that covered her head completely, and her face was thin and pale. Despite this, her eyes shone with excitement as she looked up at the famous palace. "Look, Sophie," the woman said, bending down to the girl's level. There's one of the royal guards we talked about. Should we go closer for a picture? Sophie nodded eagerly, though the movement seemed to tire her. Can they really not smile at all, Mum? She asked in a voice barely loud enough for James to hear. Not while they're working, love. It's their special job to stay still and serious, her mother explained, guiding her forward. As they approached, something tugged at James's memory. The charity event last year, the Children's Hospital fundraiser where his battalion had volunteered. He remembered now. Sophie Taylor, the little girl with the bright smile despite her illness. His niece Emma had been in treatment at the same time, though Emma had since recovered. He recalled Sophie's laughter during the magic show and how she had asked him if his soldier hat was heavy. Sophie's mother positioned her daughter about 10 feet away from James for a photo. The girl was much thinner now, her cheeks hollow where they had been round before. The yellow hat, a clear sign she had lost her hair to treatment, covered the brown curls he remembered. Stand up straight like the guard, Sophie, her mother encouraged, raising her phone to take a picture. Sophie tried her best to mimic James's stance, straightening her small shoulders and lifting her chin. The effort clearly cost her energy, but her smile never wavered. Other tourists noticed the sweet scene and stepped back to give them space, a rare moment of consideration in the usually pushy crowd. An elderly couple nearby exchanged knowing glances, the woman discreetly wiping a tear. Do you remember when we met a guard at the hospital, Mum? Sophie asked, her voice carrying to James. He said they practiced standing still for hours and hours. Yes, love, that charity day when the soldiers visited, her mother replied, adjusting the yellow hat that had slipped slightly. James's heart beat faster under his uniform. Protocol demanded he remain expressionless, eyes forward, body still. 7 years of service without a single breach of conduct. Yet as he stood there, hearing Sophie's voice, something shifted inside him. A tour guide nearby was explaining the guards' famous discipline. These guards never break character. They remain still through rain, snow, and every tourist trick imaginable. Their dedication is absolute. Sophie took a small step closer, looking up at James with wonder. Mum, does he remember us? Her mother smiled sadly. I don't think so, sweetheart. They see thousands of people every day. But James did remember. And as Sophie stood there, swaying slightly with fatigue, he found himself facing a test far harder than any military training had prepared him for. The afternoon crowd shifted around Sophie and her mother as they stood before James's guard post. A light breeze carried the sweet scent of nearby flowers, a pleasant contrast to the usual city smells. Clouds drifted overhead, occasionally blocking the sun and casting cool shadows across the palace grounds. James maintained his perfect stillness, but his mind raced with memories. He recalled the children's ward where he had volunteered during his military leave last year. The walls painted with cartoon animals, the brave smiles of children fighting battles no child should face, and Sophie, her brown eyes lighting up when he and other soldiers arrived in uniform to bring gifts and entertainment. Let's get a better picture, Sophie, her mother said, guiding her daughter a few steps to the left. The light is better here. As they moved, James noticed how Sophie's mother supported her, one arm constantly ready to catch the girl if she stumbled. He saw the medical alert bracelet on Sophie's thin wrist and the way she moved with careful, deliberate steps. The yellow hat that covered her head shifted, revealing skin where eyebrows should have been. A tourist guide nearby continued explaining to her group. The guards' training is incredibly strict. They learn to stand motionless for up to 6 hours during rehearsals. Nothing can make them break character, not rain, not heat, not illness. Sophie's mother bent down to her daughter's level. Are you feeling okay, sweetheart? Do you need to sit down? I'm okay, Mum, just a little tired, Sophie replied, her voice soft but determined. Can we stay a bit longer? I want to see if his eyes move. Her mother laughed gently. All right, but just for a few more minutes. We still need to rest before meeting Dr. Wilson this evening. Dr. Wilson, James's brother Robert, a specialist at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. Everything connected now. Robert had mentioned a special patient coming for a final consultation before beginning hospice care. The realization hit James like a physical blow, though his face remained impassive. Sophie took a tentative step forward, studying James with curious eyes. Mum, I think this might be the same guard from the hospital. His eyes look the same. Her mother glanced up at James more carefully. I don't know, love. They'd all wear the same uniform, and the hats make it hard to tell. A group of teenage boys pushed through the crowd, laughing and joking loudly. One of them pointed at James. Hey, I bet I can make him laugh, the tallest boy declared, stepping forward with a ridiculous expression. Sophie's mother protectively moved her daughter aside as the boys crowded closer. James maintained his focus, but kept Sophie in his peripheral vision as she was jostled by the moving crowd. Please be careful, Sophie's mother said to the teenagers. My daughter isn't well. The boys barely acknowledged her, continuing their attempts to distract James. One pretended to fall dramatically while another made faces inches from James's nose. Through it all, the guard remained perfectly still, his discipline unbroken. Sophie watched with wide eyes, leaning against her mother for support. They won't make him move, will they, Mum? He's too good at his job. No, sweetheart. These guards are trained to stay still no matter what, her mother assured her. As the boys finally grew bored and moved on, Sophie's face suddenly paled even further. She reached for her mother's hand, her small fingers trembling slightly. Mum, I feel dizzy, she whispered. Her mother immediately guided her to a nearby bench. Let's sit down, love. I'll get your medicine. James watched from the corner of his eye as Sophie's mother fumbled in her bag for medication. The girl's breathing had become shallow, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. Other tourists continued to snap photos, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding just feet away. Sophie looked up, her eyes meeting James for just a moment. In that brief connection, though protocol demanded he show nothing, James felt something more powerful than years of military training beginning to stir within him. The afternoon sun dipped behind a cloud, casting a momentary shadow across the palace grounds. Sophie sat on the bench, her breathing still too quick and shallow. Her mother continued searching through her bag with increasing desperation. I can't find your emergency medicine, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. I think it might be in the other bag back at the hotel. Sophie nodded weakly. It's okay, Mum. Maybe I just need water. A kind tourist offered a bottle of water, which Sophie's mother accepted gratefully. Thank you, she said, helping Sophie take small sips. The girl's hand shook slightly as she held the bottle. James remained at his post, his eyes facing forward as required, but his awareness entirely focused on the small drama unfolding nearby. Years of military training had taught him to observe his surroundings while appearing oblivious. He noticed Sophie's lips taking on a bluish tint. He saw her mother's increasing anxiety as she checked her daughter's pulse. Most of the tourists continued their visit unaware, snapping photos and listening to guides explain the history of the palace and its famous guards. A young couple posed for a selfie directly in front of James, laughing as they tried to find the right angle. Excuse me, Sophie's mother called out to a palace staff member walking nearby. Is there a medical office here? My daughter needs help. The staff member, a woman in a dark suit, hurried over. We can call for assistance. What seems to be the problem? As they spoke, Sophie suddenly stood up from the bench. I want to see the guard again, she said, taking an unsteady step forward. Sophie, wait, her mother called, reaching for her. But Sophie had already moved toward James, her steps wobbly and uncertain. I remember you, she said softly, looking up at him. You showed me your medals at the hospital. You told me I was braver than any soldier. James heard every word, though his expression remained fixed. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air. Sophie, please come sit down, her mother urged, following closely behind. The palace staff member was already on her radio, calling for medical assistance. We have a child in distress near the East Guard post, she reported. Possible medical emergency. Sophie took another step toward James, now just 3 feet away from his position, her eyes, bright with fever, locked onto his. I kept the medal you gave me, she said. I wear it when I'm scared. The crowd around them began to notice something was wrong. People stepped back, creating a small space around Sophie and her mother. Whispers spread through the gathering. Is the little girl okay? Someone should help her. The poor thing looks ill. Sophie's mother reached her daughter and put a supportive arm around her shoulders. Come on, love. Help is coming. Let's go sit down again. But as they turned to walk back to the bench, Sophie's legs suddenly gave way, her small body crumpled, beginning to fall toward the hard stone ground. Sophie, her mother cried, lunging forward. Time seemed to slow for James Wilson. In that split second, he saw everything with crystal clarity. Sophie falling, her mother's outstretched arms that wouldn't reach her in time, the gasps from the crowd, the centuries of tradition that demanded he remain motionless. 7 years without breaking character. 7 years of perfect discipline. 7 years of representing the unwavering dedication of the Royal Guards. All of it weighed against one small life. Without hesitation, James broke position. He stepped forward with military precision but unmistakable purpose, moving from his post for the first time in his guard career. His white-gloved hands reached out, catching Sophie before she hit the ground. The crowd fell completely silent. Hundreds of phones raised simultaneously to capture the unthinkable moment, a Royal Guard breaking character. As James knelt, supporting Sophie's weight with one arm, the only sound was her mother's relieved sob as she rushed to her daughter's side. Complete silence fell over the usually bustling palace grounds. Tourists froze in place, many with mouths open in shock. The Royal Guard, the living symbol of unwavering discipline, had moved. James knelt on one knee, still supporting Sophie with a steady arm. Her small body felt frighteningly light against his scarlet uniform. Up close, he could see how illness had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the skin beneath her eyes. "Sophie," her mother cried, dropping to her knees beside them. "Thank you," she whispered to James, her eyes filled with tears. James nodded slightly, another break in protocol. 7 years of perfect service shattered in seconds, but as he looked at Sophie's pale face, he felt no regret. Phones recorded every moment from all angles. A Japanese tourist whispered a translation to her companions. An American family stood speechless. Even the palace staff member stared in disbelief before remembering to continue calling for medical help. "The ambulance is 2 minutes away," she announced, regaining her composure. Sophie's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at James with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "You moved," she said softly. "They said you never move." "Some things are more important than standing still," James replied quietly, breaking yet another rule by speaking while in uniform. Sophie's mother fumbled in her purse and finally found a small pill case. "Here, Sophie, take your medicine." As Sophie swallowed the emergency medication, the crowd began to stir again. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond. "Did you see that?" He caught her. "Is that allowed? Will he get in trouble?" From the corner of his eye, James saw his commanding officer, Captain Harris, pushing through the crowd with 2 other palace officials. Their faces showed a mixture of concern and displeasure. 7 generations of Harris men had served in the Royal Guards. Tradition meant everything to the captain. Sophie's breathing steadied slightly as her medication began to work. "I knew it was you," she said to James, "from the hospital." "I remember you too," James replied, still holding her steady. "You were teaching the younger children to make paper cranes." Her mother looked up in surprise. "You really do remember her?" James nodded. "My niece Emma was in the same ward. Sophie showed her how to make the cranes too." Captain Harris reached them, his face unreadable. "Wilson," he said stiffly, "what's happening here?" Before James could answer, Sophie's mother stood up. "Your guard saved my daughter from falling. She has leukemia and sometimes collapses without warning. He caught her when I couldn't reach her in time." The captain's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at Sophie. "I see. Is medical assistance on the way?" "Yes, sir," the palace staff member confirmed. "Ambulance arriving now." The distant wail of sirens cut through the murmuring crowd. Palace security began clearing a path for the medical team to enter. James knew he should return to his post. Years of training told him to stand up, resume position, and face whatever consequences would come later. But Sophie still leaned against him, her breathing shallow but stable. "Wilson," Captain Harris said in a low voice, "this is highly irregular." "I understand, sir," James replied, his voice even. The captain looked from James to Sophie, then to the crowd still recording every moment. His lined face showed the internal struggle between duty and humanity. "Stay with her until the medics arrive," he finally said. Then returned to position. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The crowd had swelled as word spread. Hundreds of tourists pressed forward, trying to glimpse this unprecedented scene, a royal guard breaking centuries of tradition to help a sick child. As the paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, Sophie looked up at James one last time. "Are you going to get in trouble?" she asked, her voice small with worry. James managed a slight smile, his final breach of protocol. "Don't worry about me," he said. "Just focus on getting better." The paramedics reached them, quickly assessing Sophie's condition. As they prepared to move her to the stretcher, James gently released his support, letting the professionals take over. The ambulance departed with flashing lights but no sirens, carrying Sophie and her mother to the nearby hospital. James stood once again at his post, his face returned to its expressionless state, but nothing else was the same. The crowd had doubled in size as word spread through social media. Palace officials struggled to maintain order as visitors pushed forward, hoping to see the guard who had broken tradition to save a child. "That's him," whispered a woman to her husband, pointing discreetly at James. "The one who caught the little girl." "I got the whole thing on video," another tourist said, replaying the footage on his phone for those around him. "Already has 5,000 views online." James maintained his forward gaze, but he could feel Captain Harris watching him from nearby. The captain stood with the palace public relations officer, a conversation tense and hushed. 7 generations of Harris men had served in the guards without incident. Now, during his command, tradition had been broken in front of hundreds of witnesses with video evidence spreading worldwide. Palace phones rang constantly as news agencies requested statements. Social media exploded with hashtags. #RoyalGuardHero and #ProtocolBreaker competed for trending status. The palace's official accounts remained silent, but that didn't stop the story from spreading. At the changing of the guard ceremony, the replacement guards marched in with perfect precision. When James's replacement arrived, they performed the elaborate handover ritual as if nothing unusual had happened. Only the slight tightness around the new guard's eyes suggested he knew what had occurred at this post earlier. James marched away with measured steps, his face still showing nothing. Inside, however, his mind raced. Would he face military discipline? Would his career be over? The weight of these questions pressed on him as he entered the guards' quarters. Inside, away from public view, the atmosphere was electric. Guards who had heard about the incident watched him with mixed expressions. Some nodded in silent approval. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the breach of their sacred protocols. "Wilson, called Sergeant Mills, his direct superior. Captain Harris wants to see you immediately." The walk to the captain's office felt longer than usual. James passed portraits of guards from previous centuries, their stern faces seeming to judge him for breaking their hallowed tradition. When he reached the office, he knocked sharply, entered, and stood at attention. Captain Harris sat behind his desk, phone in hand. He motioned for James to wait as he finished his call. "Yes, sir, I understand the concerns. We are handling the situation internally," he said to whoever was on the line. "I assure you, appropriate measures will be taken." He hung up and fixed James with a hard stare. "Wilson, do you understand what you've done today?" "Yes, sir. I broke protocol while on duty, sir." The captain leaned back in his chair. "The palace press office has received over 200 media inquiries in the last hour. The video has been viewed more than 1 million times. The royal family has been informed." James stood straighter, preparing himself for the worst. "I spoke with the hospital," Captain Harris continued, his voice softening slightly. "The girl, Sophie, is stable but very ill. Her mother asked me to thank you." For a moment, neither man spoke. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall filled the silence. "What you did today goes against everything the Royal Guards stand for, Wilson," the captain finally said. "Discipline, tradition, unwavering dedication to duty. Yes, sir." "And yet?" The captain stood and walked to the window. "The public relations team informs me that the response has been overwhelmingly positive. The palace switchboard is flooded with calls from people commending your actions." Outside the window, tourists still gathered, pointing toward the guard posts where it had happened. "Your brother is Dr. Robert Wilson at Great Ormond Street Hospital?" the captain asked. "Yes, sir, he's Sophie's specialist." Captain Harris nodded slowly. "I've been informed that representatives from the royal family wish to know more about Sophie's condition." He turned to face James. "This situation is unprecedented in modern times. The protocol breach cannot be ignored, but neither can the circumstances. James remained at attention, waiting for his sentence. For now, you're relieved of public guard duty, the captain said finally. Report to administration tomorrow at 800 hours. This incident will require careful handling. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As James left the office, his phone buzzed in his pocket, something that would normally never happen while on duty. It was a text from his brother Robert. The palace just called about Sophie. What did you do? Evening fell over London as James sat in the hospital waiting room. The sterile smell and bright fluorescent lights brought back memories of visiting his niece during her treatment. He had changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple blue sweater that made him look like any ordinary visitor rather than the guard who had become an overnight internet sensation. His brother Robert approached, white coat wrinkled from a long day of treating patients. You've caused quite a stir, he said, sitting beside James. I've had 3 calls from palace officials and 1 from a royal aide asking about Sophie. How is she? James asked, leaning forward. Robert's face grew serious. Not good. The cancer has spread despite our best efforts. That's why she and her mother were in London. For a final consultation and to see some sights before. He didn't finish the sentence. How long? James asked quietly. 3 months at most. We tried every treatment available. She's fought bravely for 2 years. Robert ran a hand through his thinning hair. Her mother wanted to give her some special memories in the time she has left. Seeing Buckingham Palace and the guards was at the top of Sophie's list. A nurse approached them. Dr. Wilson, Mrs. Taylor says you and your brother can come in now. Sophie's hospital room was decorated with drawings from other children and cards wishing her well. She lay in bed looking even smaller than she had at the palace, but her eyes brightened when she saw James. It's the guard who caught me, she said with a tired smile. Her mother stood and offered her hand to James. I can't thank you enough. If she had fallen, she didn't need to finish the thought. I'm glad I was there, James replied simply. Sophie pointed to a small table beside her bed where a shiny object caught the light. Look, I still have it. James recognized the silver medal, a replica of a service medal he had given her during the hospital charity event last year. You kept it all this time? I take it to all my treatments, Sophie explained. Mum says I'm the bravest person she knows, just like you said. Mrs. Taylor wiped a tear from her eye. What you did today, breaking all those rules to help Sophie, I don't know how to thank you. There's something you should know, Robert interjected gently. James could face serious consequences for what he did. The guards never break character while on duty. It's a tradition that goes back centuries. Sophie's face fell. You'll get in trouble because of me. James sat carefully on the edge of her bed. Some rules are meant to be broken, Sophie, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. A nurse knocked and entered with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here asking to see Sophie. Says she's from the palace. Everyone turned as a well-dressed woman entered carrying a large basket tied with royal blue ribbon. Good evening, she said warmly. I'm Lady Margaret Winfield, personal assistant to Her Majesty. The Queen was most distressed to hear about what happened today and asked me to bring these gifts and her personal wishes for Sophie's recovery. The room fell silent as Lady Margaret placed the basket beside Sophie's bed. Her Majesty was quite moved by the story. She asked me to tell you, Private Wilson, that while protocol is important, compassion is a value the Crown holds in the highest regard. She turned to Sophie. The Queen also extends an invitation for you and your mother to visit the palace gardens privately when you're feeling stronger. Sophie's eyes grew wide. Really? The Queen knows about me? Indeed she does, Lady Margaret confirmed. Your story has touched many hearts today, including Her Majesty's. As the royal assistant chatted with Sophie about the contents of the gift basket, Robert pulled James aside. Do you realize what's happening? The palace is publicly supporting what you did. James nodded slowly, understanding the significance. It's not about me, it's about Sophie. It's about both of you, Robert corrected. They could have disciplined you quietly and ignored the story. Instead, they're embracing it. This changes everything. Outside the hospital, reporters had gathered, hoping for a glimpse of the guard who had broken tradition for a dying child. The story was spreading far beyond what anyone could have predicted. 1 month after the incident at Buckingham Palace, James Wilson stood at attention in his full ceremonial uniform. This time, however, he wasn't at his usual guard post. Instead, he stood in the palace gardens where a small gathering had assembled on a crisp autumn morning. Flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds, creating splashes of color against the manicured green lawns. Sophie sat in a wheelchair, wrapped in a soft blanket despite the mild weather. Her yellow hat had been replaced with a beautiful blue scarf tied elegantly around her head. Beside her, her mother watched with tears in her eyes as Captain Harris approached, carrying a small box. On behalf of the Queen's Guard, the captain announced formally, "I present this honorary Guards badge to Sophie Taylor, who has shown courage beyond measure." Sophie's thin hands trembled as she accepted the box. Inside lay a miniature version of the Guards badge, specially made for her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice weak but happy. The past month had brought unexpected changes. Rather than disciplinary action, James had found himself at the center of a quiet revolution within the palace. The video of his actions had been viewed over 50 million times worldwide. Letters poured in from people sharing stories of their own children's battles with illness, praising James for choosing humanity over protocol. Today's ceremony was small, attended only by Sophie's family, a few palace officials, and select guards. A palace photographer captured the moment for the official royal social media accounts, where the story had been shared with the simple caption, "Duty, honor, and compassion." "Private Wilson," Captain Harris said, turning to James. "Step forward." James took 3 precise steps forward and stood at attention. "In recognition of your actions, which exemplify the highest standards of service and compassion, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal." A murmur of approval rippled through the small gathering. Promotions within the Queen's Guard were rare and typically came only after many more years of service. "Furthermore," the captain continued, "a new protocol has been established, which shall henceforth be known as the Sophie Taylor Provision. This provision allows guards to break formation in cases of medical emergency, or when immediate assistance is required to prevent harm." Sophie's mother covered her mouth in surprise. To have a royal protocol named after her daughter was an honor none could have imagined. After the ceremony, as attendees enjoyed tea and cakes served by palace staff, James knelt beside Sophie's wheelchair. "How are you feeling today?" he asked gently. "Tired," she admitted, "but happy. Dr. Wilson says I can go home tomorrow." James nodded. His brother had explained that Sophie would now receive hospice care at home, making her remaining time as comfortable as possible. "Will you visit me sometimes?" Sophie asked. "You can wear normal clothes. I won't tell anyone you're really a royal guard." James smiled. "I promise." A palace aide approached them. "Excuse me, Lance Corporal Wilson. There's someone who would like to meet Sophie." They looked up to see a familiar figure walking toward them, Princess Charlotte, the young royal who rarely made public appearances. She carried a small gift wrapped in silver paper. "Hello, Sophie," the princess said warmly. "I heard about your bravery and wanted to meet you myself." As the princess sat beside Sophie, sharing stories and laughter, James stepped back to stand beside Captain Harris. "You know," the captain said quietly, "in my family's 7 generations of service, we've upheld tradition above all else." "Yes, sir," James replied, expecting criticism despite his promotion. "But my grandfather once told me something I never truly understood until now," the captain continued. "He said the greatest tradition of all is remembering why we serve." Together they watched as Sophie showed Princess Charlotte her honorary badge, her face alight with joy despite her illness. 2 months later, when Sophie passed away peacefully at home, her family found comfort in knowing her story had changed one of Britain's oldest institutions. At her funeral, 6 royal guards in full ceremonial uniform served as pallbearers, an unprecedented honor approved by the Queen herself. Outside the church, thousands of people gathered, many wearing yellow ribbons for childhood cancer awareness. Among them stood James Wilson, no longer just a guard who had broken protocol, but a symbol of what happens when compassion guides duty. In the years that followed, whenever new guards trained at Buckingham Palace, they learned not only about unbreakable discipline but also about the Sophie Taylor Provision, a rule that reminds them that behind their unwavering stance beats a very human heart.